So, while some of you might know me as the poet Ravi Shankar, a certified word nerd and possessed of an almost diagnosable inability to play the sitar or any other instrument, if you want to clear out a karaoke party, I'm your man. But what you might not know is that I also happen to be a numbers guy. Much as I love a well metered 14-line sonnet, I also don't mind a juicy dividend yield or a royal flush in a game of poker. I also happen to be fascinated by statistics. While they can be manipulated by pollsters and partisans, intrinsically they provide a useful statistical lens with which to view the world. For instance, what do you think might have cost $70,000 a year here in Massachusetts back in 2018? New Tesla? Tuition to Harvard or Tufts? No. According to the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, that was the cost to house one inmate per fiscal year. By comparison, Harvard's tuition was around $50,000. And moreover, Massachusetts school districts spent just under an average of $17,000 per student during this same period. Now, let me hit you with another number, one that's seared into my soul forever. 396964. That happens to be my own inmate number, for I have the dubious distinction of being the first academic in American history to be promoted to full professor while being incarcerated. So, so I don't just have an academic curiosity about this subject, but a personal obligation to reflect on what this experience taught me, both about myself and about the country that we live in. Now, I violated probation by driving on a suspended license, and as a result, I had to serve a 90-day pretrial detention at Hartford Correctional Center, or HCC, a level 4 high security institution in Connecticut. There, I heard the rhetoric of rehabilitation, but what I saw was the reality of retribution. I watched the deepening trauma and social isolation and gradual prisonization of fellow human beings firsthand. Now, let's get back to those numbers. If we're spending more than 4 times as much on incarcerating people than we are on educating them, well, the results must be staggeringly effective, right? Well, according to the Mass DOC, during that same period, 32% of people reoffended within 3 years, while there was no discernible difference in overall crime rate. That's distressing. It also happens to be a much lower recidivism rate than much of the rest of the country. So, just to make sure that we understand, let me just rephrase that. I live in a state where traditionally it has cost more to incarcerate someone than it does to educate them at Harvard. And the net result of that expenditure, taxed from our hard-earned salaries, is a 1/3% failure rate? As a citizen, I want to know, how could this kind of institutional incompetence have been allowed to exist for so long? And what does it end up costing us? Now, let me overlay those statistics with another from Massachusetts, and I encourage all of you to do the same wherever you live. Here, according to the Vera Institute of Justice, Black people constitute just 7% of the state's population, but 27% of the people in prison. Include the indigenous population and Hispanic population, and that number becomes closer to half. It's no coincidence that the 2 great moments of prison growth in American history, one happened in the post-Reconstructionist South after the Civil War, and the other happened at the end of the civil rights movement of the 1970s. Comes down to systemic racism. In response to school desegregation and the end of Jim Crow, opponents of civil rights just found new ways to separate and punish racial minorities. They used a seemingly race-neutral concern over crime and public safety to disproportionately criminalize the very population who were finally gaining access to the fundamental human rights supposedly guaranteed them by the American Constitution. Our prisons are still shaped by this prejudice. During my stay at HCC, men were moved in and out continuously and capriciously. But the one consistent factor was the racial disparity. Of the nearly 120 men that I encountered, over 100 were men of color. These men rapped. They rolled out mofongo, which is Puerto Rican street food. They braided each other's hair. They shared their hopes and dreams with me. Some of them their crimes. Others pled their innocence. Still others shared details of the trauma of their incarceration. Stuck together, I saw parts of myself in each of them. In the prison system, everyone has a nickname. And one of the men, Supreme, had a cash bond on him of $1,000 for smoking a joint, which means he could have gotten out for just a couple of $100 while he waited for trial. But no one could or would pay, and he had been waiting there for 8 months while each time he went to court, his case was continued. During that time, he had flunked out of night school, lost his job, and missed the birth of his first child. Another, chaos, illiterate, a self-avowed, brutal junkie crackhead, terrified me before we spoke. And then he shared the story of his own father's incarceration and his father before that. As a child, he'd spent one winter in the back of his uncle's Buick and another under a bridge, always hustling to survive. And yet, he'd become a doting father, an astonishingly good chess player, intrepid enough to build a convection oven out of parts scavenged from the trash can in the chow hall. I taught him the alphabet, and watching him write his daughter's name, Aaliyah, on the back of a napkin remains one of my proudest moments as a teacher. I still wonder, what he might be able to contribute to society with the right mental health assistance. And then there was OG. It's a generic nickname signifying original gangsta, and used on many inmates above a certain age. Now, this particular OG had been a Muslim for nearly a decade, and he taught me about Islamic contemplation, Sufi meditation, metacognitive awareness. He had decided that though his body might be imprisoned for 30 years without parole, his mind would remain free. These were just a small cross-section of the men I met, vastly different from me because of my relative privilege, and yet remarkably similar nonetheless because we'd each experienced discrimination in some guys because of our skin color. Some of them had mental health issues or addiction problems, but these were not being addressed at HCC. Instead, the officer in charge of giving out meds, often the wrong ones, would announce his presence over the intercom by blaring in the voice of a carnival barker. "Screws, schizos, come get your Skittles." I mean, imagine that voice in your mirror as you took meds prescribed to you by a doctor. The correctional system I experienced was meant to dysregulate, not rehabilitate the men inside. books were censored, food intentionally inedible, exorbitantly priced phone calls were eavesdropped on, and even the bathrooms were surveilled spaces. The result of these punitive practices is a generational cycle that perpetuates instead of heals the trauma and inequality that causes crime in the first place. Then, when these men and women get out, they carry their shame and the stigma of having a criminal record like a puritanical scarlet letter, which almost automatically disqualifies them from rejoining us as productive members of society. Given the high rates of recidivism and the high costs of prison, this ends up costing all of us. How much? Well, according to the Prison Policy Initiative, mass incarceration costs the government and the families of justice-involved people at least $182 billion every single year. Over 75% of that amount goes to administration and security, not to helping people, and the results speak for themselves. I propose looking longitudinally and laterally for a better way. First, to understand the roots of the criminal justice system, we need to consider those smock and collared Puritans who brought with them from England the bloody codes, severe laws against unconformity. Church attendance was mandatory. You could be arrested for overdressing. A child could be put to death for cursing their parents. And a quick glance at the census report from the Massachusetts Bay Colony tells us all we need to know about the male supremacy of the time. The women, can't make this stuff up, were named things like silence, patience, prudence, comfort, fear, and be fruitful. The gory punishments, the dunkings, the brandings, the pillorings, the whippings, the executions, all took place in public to serve as a message. Now, the Quakers, who were kind of the leftists of their time, they felt that these medieval forms of punishment had no place in the new colonies. So they advocated for reforming the criminal code to use jails as places of potential redemption. They introduced things like enforced silence and enforced labor as seemingly kinder principles. That's why there's a connection between the penitentiary and the penitent, and why some of these kinder principles still exist today in the form of solitary confinement and prison labor. This might have been different than hanging someone in a public square, but the Puritan impulse of shaming and violence never really left. It just drifted into spaces built not just to keep people in, but to keep the public out. I believe to mend our broken criminal justice system, we need to embrace impuritanical thinking. As a former Chief Justice Emeritus of the Navajo Nation Supreme Court said, America responds to crime after the fact, not before the fact. While in many indigenous communities, dispute resolution involve everyone affected by an offense, and the emphasis is on repairing harm instead of inflicting punishment. The ultimate goal is to reintegrate the offender by helping them take responsibility for their actions as a community member. What if we used elements of that model to make our interventions earlier and our laws less about punishment and more about healing for everyone involved? In Norway, they've moved away from a punitive approach to one that emphasizes the humanity of its prisoners. And now, they have one of the lowest recidivism rates in the world. They use a dynamic security model, which means that the guards are constantly interacting with the incarcerated population. They're eating together, playing sports, taking classes, and moreover, because their education and job training programs robust mental health assistance, and the fostering of a humane environment, there's actually been an increase in employment rates for the formerly incarcerated and a decrease in rates of reoffending. How very impuritanical. What I experienced is how instead of being helped, the men and women who pass through prisons in America are being further harmed. Instead of being taught to take responsibility and equipped with the necessary life skills to make amends and move forward productively, they're being stigmatized, hardened, encouraged to blame the system before being released into a society which is largely unforgiving. We might lose our inmate numbers, but the shame of incarceration is ours for life. Even if offenders have fulfilled their debt to society, repented, and grown, the Puritan approach puts up obstacles to their reentry, including diminished access to housing, healthcare, employment, movement, voting rights. The impuritan approach recognizes that being away from your loved ones and having your freedom of movement restricted is punishment enough. And it doesn't take an expert to predict that an angry and abused prisoner who loses all of their rights upon reentry is one who is much more likely to reoffend. The late writer and former American pimp, Robert Beck, aka Iceberg Slim, wrote about his transformation into an author despite the conditions of prison as the prelude to a still mauled but constructive new life. That phrase has always resonated with me. That word mauled, so visceral and evocative of a criminal justice system meant to leave you marked for life. When I think back to many of the men I met, resilient, wounded, proud, resourceful, I imagine how much they would add to a workplace if given the chance. A survey of over 1,700 companies by Boston Consulting Group showed that greater diversity led to increased productivity and job satisfaction. So why not broaden our definition to include those who may have a criminal record? If properly supported, couldn't they become productive members of society and use their failures as fuel for future success? I know personally that with everything that I've been through, I have that much more to give to the classroom and to the page. I propose we rebudget that $182 billion we spend on mass incarceration each year. Let's take $20 billion of that and put it towards educational programs in at-risk neighborhoods. Let's put another $20 billion towards community-based resourcing and job assistance programs. Take $20 billion and put it towards medical and mental health care, and $20 billion to create more affordable housing. That would still leave us over $100 billion to help reshape the criminal justice system into something more effective and humane, while simultaneously boosting the economy and helping keep us all safer. Today, I teach in prisons in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, and I always arrive to class with eagerness and hope. And I always leave a little more despondent than when I arrived, knowing that these men, some of whom rival and actually exceed my more traditional students, will return to conditions that are adverse to growth and harmony and restorative justice. But then I put on my impuritan hat and I realize I'm not just teaching them, I'm learning from them. Our country is their country. Their stories are our stories. It has become a mission for me to share their truths and focus on what, and more importantly, whom, we're putting to waste as a nation. These men and women may have been mauled, may have responded by mauling others, violence, after all, being a manifestation of unexpressed grief. But there's no reason why, with our investment as fellow citizens, they can't repair the harm and go on to lead constructive lives. The Puritans, may have believed in silencing and shaming people because, after all, they themselves were criminalized for their beliefs and forced from their homelands. But the impuritan way of thinking breaks with that rigid legacy of history and realizes that only by becoming a conscientious objector to the subtle and overt violence of our criminal justice system can we emerge whole. A nation who rises above the animal instincts of our ancestors, solves the mathematics of social equity and basic human rights, and evolves. Thank you very much.